now sit back, get comfortable, as this will be a stranger presentation. As we pored over the data, we pored over the data and looked at it, it wasn't really telling us a good story. There wasn't some data is indicating, are we in a recession? Other data indicate that we were sort of in full recovery. That's going on. The only thing I can say that's constant in this economy is the uncertainty. And while uncertainty makes for a great Netflix series, it doesn't lay a firm foundation for the economy. So, with the election year next year, this year should be very interesting in terms of sort of economic policy, interest rate changes. Obviously, the Fed has announced that they're sort of inclined not to lower interest rates anymore. We've got this trade issue going on with China. So it was announced this morning that perhaps they're getting closer to a deal, perhaps they're not getting closer to a deal. But generally speaking, in December, we should have another round of tariffs put on Chinese products into the U.S. And so the other impact we have going on is, so we might have a potential shutdown. And we had one in January, February of this year. And for Maryland, that impacts us rather tremendously. So we are concerned about what's going to happen in Maryland. Now the good news is with Amazon sort of coming into the region in a couple of years, that should benefit as well. Again, we could become the cybersecurity center of the nation. So the presentation's broke up into 5 chapters. Chapter 1, Life on the Bright Side. We'll talk a little bit about sort of the good things in the economy to some degree. We'll talk about government intervention in Chapter 2, entering the upside down, and then finally we'll close up with Maryland and the economy and the current forecast. So sit back and enjoy, and let the slideshow begin. So GDP. It's growing gangbusters. Well, I wouldn't say gangbusters, maybe 1.9% most recent data. So this is a little bit lower than the predicted 3% that we were sort of proffered in the recent tax cut discussion. But generally speaking, we've had 124 months of economic growth. So we've had one of the longest post-World War II expansions ever. So we're number one, 124 months of economic growth. Now, while it's not been spectacular, it's been steady growth. There's been steady employment growth, over 150,000 jobs a month growth, which is good. It's above replacement numbers. We've also experienced solid GDP growth, average about 2% over the last 124 months. It is great, and in spite of the uncertainty that we have created going on in the economy, both in terms of legislative issues, presidential races, we have grown for the last 124 months, which is fantastic. And driving that growth, is consumers, households. Households feel very positive about the economy. And they're showing it by spending money, increasing their debt. Obviously, credit card debt is rising. But generally speaking, they are spending money as they feel very optimistic about the future. Well, why wouldn't you? You're hearing unemployment rate being at 3.6%. You're hearing that the number of jobs is growing. The economy is growing. So as a household, you can make decisions based upon sort of these macro data indications. Plus, if you look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average, it's reaching new records. So these are great opportunities. So consumers are feeling very confident about the economy. That being said, private investment is kind of holding a little bit flat. Now, this is type of investment in factories and machinery that are used to provide goods or services. So factories are kind of maybe pulling back. So business owners are maybe pulling back their investment in future factories and future machines. So that is kind of a bit unsettling in some sense, basically. What's going on? Are they feeling a little bit nervous about the future? Obviously, if we start pulling this back, this has sort of downstream effects in the sense of basically if they start cutting back their investments or continue to cut back, it means less expenditures on raw materials, less expenditures on logistics. So it kind of has a spillover effect. And there's sort of a bit of a mixed signal going on here. Government spending is on the rise. Now that's both good and bad. We're Typically, we spend money, and you can sort of look, even the rate of spending money has exceeded the rate we were spending money when we were actively involved in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Obviously, we had an increase in the Great Recession, 2008 to 2011. We're approaching those levels now in spite of the fact that we do not have a recession going on, or are we actively engaged in multiple wars? So there is a concern as are we increasing government spending at a faster clip? And I'll show you a next slide that talks about the deficit. Exports, about $1 trillion in trade deficit, so we like to import more than we export. We have been blessed by a strong economy, which has resulted in a strong dollar, which has resulted in the fact that now we can afford imports, but it also means the rest of the world can not afford as many of our exports. So this is kind of what's happening. So we're blessed with a strong dollar and a strong economy. As a result, we are importing more, but as that same flip side means we can be exporting less because the rest of the world cannot support or not pay for our goods and services. They'll find cheaper alternatives. This has been sort of a challenge for the current administration to really sort of understand that we are stronger because of our exports and imports. And in fact, half of the goods imported into the U.S. are intermediate goods. So these are not final goods. These are not sort of luxury handbags or infinities. These are sort of maybe an alternator or a windshield wiper or some wood that goes into a furniture. These are sort of the kind of goods that come into the U.S. that are imported that are used to produce the final goods. So when we talk about sort of slapping tariffs on the goods, we also impact the ability of domestically produced goods. So the steel that's being used into washing machines that are being made in factories in South Carolina are also impacted by these tariffs. So the raw materials that we're importing to produce goods and services also sort of are impacted by these tariffs. National unemployment rate, unemployment remain low. 3.6%, 50-year low, just tremendous amount of unemployment. And underemployment, as you can see, is also fairly low compared to where it was historically. Now, the only thing that's a little bit sort of worrying about this is pre-recession, our labor force participation rate. That is to say, individuals aged 16 and 64 who are actively employed or actively looking for work was around 66%. Post-recession, that number is about 63%. So it's about a 3% drop. Well, that translates, that might say, no, that's not very much to rise. That's only 3%, 3 percentage points. Actually, it's 8 million individuals. So somehow in this economy, we're missing 8 million individuals. Now, I know that Fortnite just was released, so that might have accounted for a few of the million. But generally speaking, so there's a kind of a concern that we're wondering, where are those missing workers? And so, we, in spite of the fact that we have a very tight labor market, we have this situation where the labor force participation rate has been historically low. I mean, at the peak in the mid-'80s or late '80s, it was around, I want to say, 67, 68%. So it's significantly different than it is now. Now, the good news is, or the bad news is, however you want to, but the number of job openings exceeds the number of people who are unemployed. So the number of new job openings actually exceeds the number of individuals who are unemployed. That's both good and bad. So one of the factors, people say, well, I can't get a job. Well, the challenge has been, is oftentimes these jobs require skills that many people don't have. So that's number one. The other thing is they may be geographically different from where they were. So, for individuals who may not be living in where the jobs are, that's a challenge. This also raises the other issue of home ownership, or housing affordability, I should say. So oftentimes where the hot job markets are, the home prices are rising, or home affordability is going through the roof. Many people cannot afford, and this is impacting employers who are trying to recruit individuals, as well as employees who have to move to these places. So oftentimes they may not take the job because they cannot afford to live in the city or in the vicinity of the city. So this is a challenge, and this is being addressed. Now, we saw the big announcement that Apple and Google and Facebook are going to put in several $1 billion to help address that, which is sort of a kind of a small drop in the bucket when you're talking about a $50 billion problem or more to address the housing affordability issues. The good news is, for those who are employed, who live and are able to afford their houses and actually are working, we're seeing that household income is rising. Now, we're not only seeing it on average, and the median household income is rising, we're also seeing it at all the quintiles. So the bottom quintile, we're seeing household income rising, as well as the top quintile. So that's good news. So we're seeing a broad-based income recovery in terms of households. Granted, 63,179 is good compared to in the late 1999 about 59,000. So a significant increase in real terms. So as I mentioned before, we're in the longest post-World War II recovery. And you can sort of see the last 5 recoveries. You can see the 1960s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, and then our present one. So if you look at this slide here, you can sort of see in the 1960s, we grew at 4.9%, nearly 5% average annual growth of GDP, a significant amount of growth, twice as fast as we're growing in the most recent recovery. Part of that is, think about the context of 1960 and sort of the world economic stage. So this is 15 years after World War II had ended. Germany and Japan had really sort of were still kind of devastated, still kind of growing their nascent factories. China wasn't even a blip on the radar in terms of its economic activity. It was 11 years after the Red Revolution, so it was still kind of going on. So when economic recovery took place in the U.S., all of that activity took place in the U.S. All the growth in car production took place in the U.S. We weren't importing alternators from the Netherlands. We weren't importing tires from Japan or Korea. The tires were made in Akron, Ohio. We were building alternators in Detroit. We were building the cars with U.S.-made steel, all that activity. So when we grew in those time periods, all that activity took place inside the U.S. Fast forward to 2009, and that activity now is dissipated. So when we grow as an economy, we also benefit the rest of the world. So China now is a second largest economy in the world. Europe is a significant block of economic growth. So when we grow as an economy, we're growing the rest of the world as well. So some of that growth is being dissipated out to the rest of the world. In fact, if you look at a domestically made pickup truck, Chrysler, for example, it has less domestic content than a Toyota Corolla that's manufactured in the U.S. So that's remarkable, right? So a U.S.-made pickup truck, the icon of American, a pickup truck made by Chrysler, has less domestic content than a Toyota Corolla. So think about sort of how much the world has sort of, is intertwined. So when we grow pickup trucks, we're also benefiting those countries that supply those parts of the pickup truck. So our consumers are very happy compared to where they were in November 2008, where this is the Consumer Sentiment Index put out by the University of Michigan. 100 is sort of the baseline where you're most happy. We've been popping around 100, give or take a few points here and there. Most recent data shows about 95.5, up and down depending upon the news cycle. Depending on a Sharpie pen, I don't know. But nevertheless, we do see that kind of going on in consumer sentiment. So consumers are much happier than they were in 2008. Now, obviously, in 2008, we were in the depths of the recession, or just starting it. Things were going off the rails. But generally speaking, consumers are happy. And as long as they're happy, that's good. Because again, we're a nation, about 70% of economic activity is driven by consumer decisions. Housing starts, so we're seeing that the whole dire prediction of millennials not buying houses is perhaps was not as true as it once we thought it was. So we're seeing housing starts kind of rise up over time, which is good. Obviously in the depth of recession, we're about 500,000 units being built. We're now at a 12-year high, about 1,400 units 1.4 million units being built. So generally speaking, we have some good news on the housing starts. Now, I will say housing starts are wrapped up in private investment as well, which means that this growth also means that the housing private investment is probably flatter than it was, or perhaps even declining, which sort of exacerbates the situation. Government intervention. So I think one of the first sort of rules of politics is do no harm. Or if you remember from the 1990s campaign slogan, it's the economy, stupid. So really, the government's role is to really sort of make sure that the table's set for firms, households to be successful. It needs to sort of figure out how it can, what it can do, what policies it can put in place to make sure that basically those things are successful. So we had a recent tax cut in 2017 that benefited corporations and to some degree some households. We've had tariffs kind of being applied, and I would argue that they've been applied rather broadly and perhaps not sort of targeted. And as a result, we've sort of run into a situation where we've created some uncertainty around a trade policy, uncertainty for firms to invest long-term. How are they going to ensure their supply chains? Because the development of a supply chain, so when we think about the Apple iPhone, of which about 90% of it, the value is created here in the US, that supply chain is critical. And it took Apple a decade to kind of get it right. And it requires sort of, clean room technology, because obviously you don't want your Apple iPhone to have dust particles inside of it. You want your Apple iPhone to make sure that the solders are going to work. So all those things, it took a long time to develop and to ensure that the quality control was there. And to all of a sudden upend that supply chain means that basically Apple and other companies that rely on these other countries to produce their goods won't be able to do it. It's about a sense of scale. So we couldn't even as the U.S. produce as many Apple iPhones as we need based upon sort of the scaling effect. So the challenge is basically when we do these arbitrary tariffs, when we sort of make changes, it impacts us. Think about the soybean farmers in the Midwest. So to develop that supply chain, develop those relationships took several decades to kind of get to the point where now we're able to sell our agricultural products to China, and actually it was a big market. In fact, targeting a lot of our pork products went there, soybeans, all went to China and other places. So all of a sudden now to upend that is going to cause some great dislocation. And in fact, we've seen that with farm incomes have plunged because of these policies. Now, arguably that China has not been a good player in the trade wars. They have IP has been routinely stolen. They have a requirement of local manufacturers to be working with foreign companies and routinely sort of borrowing our technology and not paying for it. We agree, but the tariffs might have been a bit too much of a hammer when maybe a smaller tool might have been needed in that instance. So, do no harm. And most studies have found that the tax cut had a short-term impact. It was a very short-term impact, but the longer-term impact has been minimal. And arguably, when you think about sort of the issues about what firms would use that money for, as was argued that they would use it to invest in factories and that they would use it to invest in higher wages for their employees, we've not necessarily seen that per se. Again, part of it is around the uncertainty in the economy around, so do we be investing in factories when we're uncertain about what's going to happen with trade policy? Similarly, tariffs are likely to cause a slowdown, so higher trade barriers, we think it's about 0.3% shaving off of GDP. We also think there's about 300,000 fewer jobs were created because of it. And we think that could rise to somewhere north of 1.3 million jobs in the balance of 19 and 20 if this continues. So it is kind of a concern when you start thinking about sort of what the impacts of trade has been. And we've seen that even the steel companies who were supposed to benefit from the tariffs, they're even shutting down. So we're seeing steel companies are actually cutting back their production, laying off. We're seeing coal companies also declaring bankruptcy. Again, part of this is we as a nation can't pick winners and losers. We have to sort of make sure that the table is fairly set. We have a competitive economic environment to sort of ensure that businesses are successful. But this is a case where we're actually harming ourselves tremendously. Minimal benefits, as I mentioned, on the tax cuts. And as I said, effective corporate tax fell significantly, while effective individual tax fell by a small amount. So again, and then increasing deficits. So this is kind of a concern. We're at $1 trillion in a non-recessionary period. So there is no reason why we should be this high. So when you think about sort of in the 2008, we ran up because of increasing transfer payments, unemployment insurance, those type of things, and declining tax revenues. That makes sense why it rose up. And in fact, you saw it decline even during our engagement in Iraq as well as our post-recovery period. But now we're ramping up. So we're spending at or near a greater rate than we were before, but we're also taking in less revenue. And while many Republicans, formerly budget hawks, are now okay with a $1 trillion deficit yearly, it doesn't seem like good management. I mean, right now money is cheap in terms of borrowing, so we're able to sort of borrow, and so it's not taking as big a portion of our discretionary spending as it once did. If you remember, some of you might remember from the Reagan years, we almost had double-digit interest rates, but generally speaking, what we're paying on these 30-year notes is laughably low compared to what we used to pay. So in some sense, basically, it does make sense to increase our borrowing, but as my concern is we're not spending money on things we need. So right now we think about sort of our highways. And I said this before, highways, unlike wine, don't age well. We think about sort of our infrastructure, our fiber backbone. Are we investing enough? Our ports, are we sort of investing in those? Workforce training programs, are we investing sufficiently in those things to get our students up to speed, to get our workforce up to speed? Are we investing enough in high schools? Are we investing in, so all these things that we're sort of not investing, but we're sort of running up a deficit means that basically when we need to do this, when we need to be competitive, we may not be able to do it because basically, A, either the interest rates have risen so much or we can't afford to increase our debt load. So this is kind of a concern. Running up deficits during a period of growth is sort of not the best economic policy. I would say it should be flat at least. So it's kind of a long-term concern. And you know, we know that Republicans have been obviously arguing that they're the fiscal austerity party and they understand sort of business, but this clearly doesn't look like I would trust them with my money. We're in a low interest rate environment. Obviously, we're a little higher than we were as of 15, but generally speaking, we've seen 3 interest rate cuts by the Fed. We probably won't see a 4th. In spite of the pressures, because obviously one of the challenges is interest rates kind of go too low, it may not spur the economic activity that we're beginning to see, especially when we consider the uncertainty around the future economy going forward. So entering the upside down. So now this is kind of the area where we talk about some things that just aren't, that kind of give us misleading or you know, negative impulses. So there are some data points that if we looked by themselves, we would think we're in a recession. We are in deep trouble. Oh my God, what are we going to do? So with the prior data and these data, it's really hard to kind of reconcile what is going on. Some of it is complementary, some of it's kind of going forward. But generally speaking, we have a challenge is how do you reconcile this good data with some of this misleading data? So one of the biggest challenges, we're seeing income inequality grow in this nation. So we're at the highest point we've ever been in the last several decades. So that's kind of a concern. Obviously, we're seeing more and more households being we're seeing a bigger divide between those that have and those that don't have. And it's becoming more and more costly to run a household. You know, iPhones, you know, are needed as well as other things. And the concern is, are we able to sort of, you know, continue to grow this way? To basically have an income divide that is getting closer and closer to the top 1% controlled 90% of our economy. And that's kind of a concern because we're a nation of you know, strong middle class has sort of helped our nation grow. But as we sort of get to a situation where this income inequality increases, it may not be so. And this interesting slide here, so this is Harvard's admission rates for those that are accepted. So if you're a legacy, is 33% of their admitted individuals are legacy, while only 5.9% are non-legacy. So arguably, this is a situation where if you're a legacy individual, you've had the opportunities, you've gone to Harvard, your parents have gone to Harvard, grandparents all have gone to Harvard, you will continue to probably go to Harvard. For individuals who need to get into sort of places that are Ivy League schools, they may not have as much chance to get into Harvard because they don't have they're the first generation. Going to college for many individuals is the best way to move up in the income stream. And this is critical. But when we have colleges that sort of block or don't admit as many students as they can, or don't provide the support services that they can, and I will say for Towson University, we have no achievement gap, which is fantastic. So we have inclusive education. We have inclusive graduation rates. great opportunities, but going to college means, number one, is getting into college and getting into the right college. And I would argue that Harvard is a wonderful institution, several hundred years old, but the quality of education, I would say, probably is as close, Towson University provides a very good education. What you're paying for Harvard is a network, the network of individuals, the legacy of individuals.
What's the other 60%?
Oh, I don't know. Well, no. This is saying of those that are admitted. So if you're legacy, you're third likely to be admitted. This is not the number of people who are admitted. This is just saying the ratio of those who are admitted. So 5.9% of those who are first year or non-legacy are admitted, while those who are admitted, 33% are legacy. All I'm saying is it's the rate of which they're being accepted, not the total number. This is not 33% plus 5.9%. This is saying of those that are admitted, 33% have a 33% chance of being admitted, of being a legacy student.
So there's a big discrepancy between the number of people that have graduated from Harvard versus the total number of people applying to Harvard.
There's a huge discrepancy. So Harvard has a big pool of applicants, and of those big applicants, some are legacy, and of those legacy applicants, a third of those will likely be accepted, whereas non-legacy only 5.9. Yeah, so it's slimming down. So on the legacy side, you have a better chance of being admitted than if you do a non-legacy. Student debt continues to rise. Now, this is only undergraduate debt, about $30,000 in debt when graduating. Now, remember, in undergraduate, there's a cap on the amount of debt that students can acquire. For graduate school, there is no cap. So students can go into deep debt. Oftentimes, doctors and lawyers will go into $250,000 in debt. And they're obviously expecting to make that kind of money getting out of when they graduate. This is kind of concerning, obviously, as we kind of go forward, because accessibility to college education is critical. Saddling students with debt. About 68% of students graduate with some form of debt anyways. But saddling students with debt means that basically sometimes their choice of majors will sort of impact their ability to repay that debt. There are some programs, some successful, some not so successful, that allow for students who perhaps are teaching in high poverty areas or in STEM fields to have their debt forgiven. So that's obviously a good opportunity. But generally speaking, this level of debt going out of college means that maybe they might be postponing marriage, postponing housing purchases, postponing then not buying a house, you're not buying a washing machine, you're not buying draperies, you're not buying a sofa, all that good stuff. So that means that economic expansion will take place later as they graduate, not sooner as they once was. So generally speaking, this is a concern as we go forward, and obviously it's been addressed at the federal level, the local level, as how do we make college more accessible without burdening students with debt. And many of you are aware in the summer we had the inverted yield curve, so the 10-year interest fell below the 3-month interest rate, sort of indicates a lack of confidence in the future of the economy. Investors are taking a lower interest rate for longer term because they expect rates to fall continuously. It has since sort of been re-inverted since about late October, September. So that's good news. But generally speaking, this is not a good sign to have an inverted yield curve. In fact, most economists would argue, myself included, that the inverted yield curve is oftentimes sort of the first sign of a imminent recession coming forward. U.S. manufacturing, according to the Institute of Supply Management, is their index to 100. Anything below 50 is considered to be a recessionary period. So manufacturing is in a recession. Its output has fallen significantly over the last several months, and it sort of continues to sort of decline. And this has downstream effects. So trucking employment has gone down. Trucking sales have gone down. So we're not buying as many trucks. They're not buying and not hiring as many truckers, though the recent data does show it does a slight increase. But generally speaking, logistics is impacted by manufacturing declines. Raw material purchases are affected by manufacturing declines. All those things are sort of spilling over. So we're seeing sort of these kind of things sort of indicate sort of what's going on in manufacturing. It's being adversely impacted perhaps by some of the high tariffs on steel, which is sort of then causing some of these slowdowns to take place. But generally speaking, this is sort of a pause for concern. Germany, one of the bellwether economies in the European Union, is in a recession. You know, it's had a couple of quarters of negative GDP growth. So that is a big concern. Obviously, they're a major bloc, and we're seeing it more and more in the rest of Europe, that there are some declines, slowdowns in the economy as they go forward. While we have a small, you know, our net exports about maybe 11% of our total economy, the fact is that the rest of the world is slowing down. It could impact us as well long term. There are negative interest rates in Europe for the most part. I would say for Germany and a few other countries, so that's not necessarily a good sign of a healthy economy to have negative interest rates. Japan has had negative interest rates for a significant time period. So this is a concern of an anemic economy going forward. So now we've arrived at the Maryland economy. And this is the part where we kind of look at all this stuff that's going on and ask ourselves, sort of, how does this impact us? So obviously, one of the bigger things is we're blessed and cursed by having the federal government near us. Blessed in the sense that basically that we know where they live and we know how to get the bills paid from them. But we're also cursed by the fact that they're here, and so when they have a shutdown, it impacts us. The other challenge is a lot of our businesses are oriented towards the federal government to provide janitorial services, IT services, defense contractors, all those things sort of, you know, we've built a nexus of industry around to provide services to the federal government. In fact, about 5% of our labor force is directly employed by the federal government, another 10% by support firms, everything from Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, to A1 Janitorial Services in Harford County. So when we have a shutdown or we have transfer, so we're now seeing that the federal government is moving offices to other states, that impacts Maryland to some degree, more so than other portions. Our trade, our port, we have one of the largest ports on the East Coast, a deep water port. So when we have a reduction in trade, that impacts the port. Whether it's imports or exports, that impacts the port. So they're looking at volume of in and out. And fortunately, they've been able to sort of weather it. But if this continues where we have slowdowns in trade, that does impact the port's ability to continue. And that does have a big economic impact. That's everything from Western Maryland with coal all the way through the rest of Maryland. So there's a significant footprint of the port in the state of Maryland. So the good news, and hopefully people caught the letters on this, so if you didn't, see me afterwards. So Maryland is on the rise. So our gross state product has actually increased significantly. We're about a $370 billion operation here in the state. It's good news. We've seen some somewhat good growth in the state in terms of our gross domestic product, which is good. Our numbers fluctuate. So our unemployment rate is around 3.7%. We're ranked 32nd in the nation, which is both good. And as of August of this year, so August of this year, we were looking to be shedding 15,000 jobs. 15,000 jobs that we were sort of on slate to lose. The September report came out, and actually with all the adjustments, Maryland has gained 3,600 jobs since January 2019. So that's about a fairly low growth rate in terms of jobs. So we've struggled in the state in terms of sort of being able to sort of grow the jobs, and we were very fortunate the September numbers came in strong, but generally speaking, so Maryland's unemployment is about 3.7%, US is at 3.6%. We have one of the second highest household income, and I would argue that Massachusetts and Maryland, and it's probably fairly close statistically in terms of the numbers. So we're either one or two, depending upon which day you look. But generally speaking, we're a very wealthy state. We have very high household incomes. But we're also, and as I mentioned before, our unemployment rate is slightly higher than the U.S. average. It continues to sort of to be. We also have one of the highest income inequalities in the U.S. based on the 75th percentile income versus 25th, and we're ranked 35th in terms of top 1% versus remaining 99%. And part of it is due to our high Maryland median income. Government, now this is just output. So almost 20% of our economic output is geared towards government. That's followed by Virginia at nearly 17%, Delaware at 9%, and then Pennsylvania at 8.9%. The U.S. average is about 11.5%. So our economic activity is really geared towards servicing the government sector. So as I said before, it's both a blessing and a curse. So when the government has a shutdown, it means that basically we're more adversely impacted than, say, Pennsylvania. So that is a concern. So as we sort of see these things kind of going forward, we need to sort of be aware that, the federal government is a great customer, but they're also a challenging customer sometimes. As well as, and the government sector is a dominant source of our employment. So I often say that eds, beds, meds, and feds are sort of, are the four pillars of Maryland's economy. And you can sort of kind of see government, which both includes state, federal, and local government. So this is your teachers, this is your state police individuals, this is also your federal government individuals who work at Social Security are in that top group. But you can also see the next biggest group is healthcare and social assistance. And then the one below that, professional and science technical services, are oftentimes our contractors. And then accommodation and food services are our beds, our restaurants, and our wonderful hotels that help drive the economy. But you can kind of see that basically how dominant the government sector is here in Maryland. And again, some of that plays to the proximity of the federal government to us. We've sort of made opportunities out of that. And of the 42,000, so there's 128,000 job openings in Maryland as we speak now. About 20% of those are in computer and mathematical occupations. So if your kids are in college right now, you might want to just nudge them over to IT or computer sciences or healthcare. Both are in hot demand. So 42,000 jobs of the 128,000 are in those two particular sectors. Management occupations, office admin, engineering, farming and fishing, it's probably not the military and legal occupations are sort of the three-digit growth areas. So arguably, we are a nation in which basically we are a state. We have the third highest educational attainment in the nation compared to Massachusetts and D.C. But generally speaking, we, like other states, are suffering from shortages in IT, shortages in healthcare. Part of it is healthcare is driven by demographics. Some of us are getting older. I retain my youthful vigor as ever. But some of us also are kind of ham-fisted on the IT situation. So, some of us, click on anything that comes by, and next thing you know, we've been phished. So, generally speaking, we need IT people, and we need healthcare practitioners to protect us and to help us sort of, survive IT and health. The forecast. Oh, this is it. This is it. This is all you've been waiting for. This is what you've been waiting for. I know. You've driven here. You've come here. You've had the nice breakfast with which bacon, by the way, real bacon. Oh, that's awesome. That is really good stuff. So this is the good stuff. So this is where I get to sort of shine and sort of show our prowess and economic forecasting and how great we are. So just kind of a rolling in and kind of a drum roll to the exciting part. So, while the threat of recession sort of overall has sort of receded, it's still in the back of the mind. It's still a specter out there. People sort of, what's going on. We could have a black swan event. We could have a situation in which we have an oil supply disruption in the Middle East due to the fact that Iran and the U.S. sort of kind of get into it a little bit. It's still out there. But I would really argue that we're probably in the period for sort of anemic growth. I would say that the 1.9% sort of GDP growth nationally is probably something we're probably going to be living with. I don't foresee any sort of, big change in the economy. We might have sort of a 0% growth at some point. I don't see anything coming on the horizon, sort of like the 2008 recession. That was sort of traumatic and rather a large drop in the economy. So we're not seeing that in the near term. So we are sort of, this is our forecast right here. Sort of see flat growth. As a chief economist, I get to make some changes. So, just kidding. our growth, we're predicting sort of flat growth going forward in terms of non-private, non-farm employment. These are the number of job openings in the state of Maryland. You can sort of see Central Maryland is 89,000 jobs. Now these, by the way, are what we consider to be both jobs that are due to retirement as well as new jobs. Now, this next slide will sort of make you cringe. So these are actually the new jobs that are being created in the region over the next 3 years. So in accounting for, after sort of taking out those jobs that are created because people retire, these are the net new jobs that we expect to see in the region going forward. So 4,482 in the region. And so our forecasted job growth is about 9,000 jobs a year, maybe 9.8 thousand jobs a year. 2021, 8 jobs. Not 10, not 5, 8. 8 jobs total. So really 0 jobs, I would say, in 2021. So we're figuring over 9.8 thousand jobs per year for the next 3 years. It's about a 0.4% growth, which is a little bit higher than we are currently, given the fact that we've only created 3.6 thousand jobs. Most recent data. So generally speaking, we're expecting some flat growth. I'll be curious to see how close we are to the 8. Are we plus minus? I just really want to hone in on that. And I know my team has told me that this is a pizza's riding on this number. So heavy stuff, heavy stakes on this number. Forecasted annual job growth, you can sort of see in the IT and healthcare is critical. That's where we see those sectors growing. Other services have public administration, administrative support. So this last one, administrative support, waste management, and remediation is really temp workers. Accommodation and food services are continuing to grow. We expect the government sector to perhaps see some slowdown. Manufacturing obviously see some slowdown going forward. And construction remaining to be challenged in terms of growth. Occupation, personal care and services. So this could be everything from hairdressers to dry cleaners, food preparation and serving related. So we want to eat, we want to look good, and we also want to make sure that we have our IT taken care of. We want to be educated, and management teams and business and financial operations are critical. So the top growth areas are sort of in healthcare still, as well as IT. So these are sort of where we're predicting in the next 3 years the occupational growth will be going forward. And forecasted annual job growth by zone. So 1 is you've got a pulse. 5 is you've got a doctorate or a JD or a MD license. So 58%, nearly 60% of the new jobs that we're forecasting by occupation are going to require a bachelor's degree or higher going forward. So it's going to be very technical in nature. So we're still not saying we don't need individuals with pulses, and that's always a good sign of being alive. We want that in your employment. But generally speaking, we're fairly cautiously optimistic about the state of Maryland. I don't like using that statement. That feels like a double negative. But generally speaking, state of Maryland, there's some good positives going on. We continue to see some challenges, and oftentimes we overlook sort of some of the assets that we have here. We have a great port. We have great educational institutions. We have great hospitals. We have great federal installations, both on the military side as well as the civilian side. So we have great assets here in the state of Maryland. We have a highly educated workforce, as I said, third in the nation in terms of bachelor degree attainment. We have a significant amount of federal research dollars flowing into the state. I would say areas where we definitely need to improve is entrepreneurship, an area in which basically we don't have much traction. We've not been able to sort of create opportunities for startup companies, and hopefully, as President Schatzel said, our armory will be sort of that first start where we can kind of move this needle forward. Startup companies, those somewhere between 5 and 9 employees, generate the greatest greatest jobs in the economy, not the greatest jokes. I do that. But there typically our growth is going to be driven by small businesses. It's not going to be driven by the Northrop Grummans or the General Dynamics or the Lockheed Martins. It's going to be driven by small companies that are starting that we don't even know with the new technology going to use next week, next year. So these are the opportunities. So we as a state need to lay the groundwork and the foundation for them to be successful, for them to sort of thrive and grow and have a great access to a great employment base here at Towson University. 80% of undergraduates stay within the state of Maryland, doing wonderful things. So I think with that, I'm done. So thank you very much.
I'll start things off with kind of the first one here for you, Darius. So it's 2019. Our 2020 Economic Outlook Forum will probably happen maybe right after the election. And in the meantime, we have a series of local and state elections that are going to be coming up. Obviously, there's going to be a special election for Senator Cummings' seat. There is a pretty major race on right now that's shaping up for Baltimore City Mayor. What are going to be some of the key storylines that you think we really need to be watching for in our local elections over the next year as they relate to the economy?
Thank you. Stumped the question. So for Baltimore City, one of the challenges is sort of having stable leadership. Because I think really with good leadership in Baltimore City, we should be able to see great growth. Oftentimes, many of the suburbs discount Baltimore City as sort of saying, well, that's not really part of us. It is part of us. Baltimore City, as goes Baltimore City, so goes the rest of the state. We have to be very, very cognizant of the fact that Baltimore City is part of us. Our port is there. Many of our major institutions are there. So we need to make sure that Baltimore City is able to thrive. And one of the things that needs to critically get is stable leadership. We can't have a revolving door of mayors come in and out. We need to sort of fix that issue. And we need to have sort of, as I said, good leadership in the area. Because good leadership really helps move the ball forward. You cannot underestimate just how important that is to have good, strong leaders with a great vision of Baltimore City and able to achieve that vision. So I think that's going to be critical. So the mayor's race is going to be critical for Baltimore City going forward.
Yeah, great. Does anybody out in the audience have any questions for Darius? I know we had a lot of slides, so I'm sure there's a lot of things. Yes?
So you didn't talk much about infrastructure and investment in infrastructure. So speaking of Baltimore City, potholes are rampant. The water system has lots of issues. We know they're under a consent decree to replace the pipes. So is that investment already accounted for in this? And what would be the impact of additional government investment and programs to support infrastructure development?
So those dollars aren't accounted for in our forecast. Again, it's been a real challenge. I mean, Baltimore City has sort of fixed infrastructure as needed. But there's been no comprehensive plan to come up with a bigger solution of how do we replace all the water pipes, make sure we have paved roads in Baltimore City, but also amongst the rest of the state as well as the nation. So we have sorely underinvested in our infrastructure. Everyone wants to do ribbon cutting on a new road, a new sewer plant, but no one wants to do the ribbon cutting for the maintenance budget. And oftentimes maintenance budgets aren't put in as sufficiently, and as a result we get a situation where we have, I would say daily water pipe breaks in Baltimore City. We have delayed maintenance on roads, which results in sort of deeper potholes that basically a small car can fit in many instances. But we also have situations where we have failing bridges, which is of a deeper concern to me. I mean, if my car had a pothole, it's fine. I don't want to fall off a bridge. I don't find that to be sort of life enhancing. But generally speaking, we as a nation have underinvested in our infrastructure. We continue to do so. We continue to push that ball further back. And as I said, one of the biggest mistakes we could have made was during the 2008 recession when interest rates were very low. We had a lot of capacity, was not take advantage of that situation to really ramp up infrastructure redevelopment. But the politics weren't there. We ended up doing things, I would say, probably not as good as we could have. But really, that was an opportunity to really to move the ball forward. Now, with our deficit so high, the concern is, would we be able to even consider investing? I mean, obviously, there's been some plans floated by our president to indicate that it would be a public-private partnership, which only works if there's a revenue opportunity for the private sector, not necessarily sort of doing it for the good of the country. So generally speaking, it's going to be a challenge. I mean, we might have more toll roads if it private-public partnership, because again, given the way the financials work on those situations. So I would say it would be impactful. It would pull a lot of people into work. It would provide great opportunities. And as I said before, I think we did a study a couple of years ago, maybe about 10, 15 years ago. Having good roads actually adds about 0.2% to overall economic growth. So if it was 2% growth, it'd be 2.2% growth with good and great roads. So there is an economic value to having good infrastructure.
Great.
There are two activities that are going on in our economy right now, and the two are AI, and the other is quantum computing. How is that going to affect our economy in the long run? Because that's going to affect a lot of jobs that are white-collar jobs, and what are we going to do with these people when they have no job?
So that is, we're already seeing sort of autonomous, trucks kind of coming online. Again, that's going to, because again, the challenge has been to get enough workers into those positions. AI continues to be sort of a specter out there in terms of long-term. But, one of the things is making sure that our educational system, workforce development, keep up with the change in technology to provide opportunities. With AI, yes, some jobs will go, but then new jobs will be created. So when we started thinking about sort of, 10 years ago, 11, 12 ago, who knew about, phone apps? But now there's a whole, industry, occupations around phone development apps. So there are opportunities that are created by new technology coming in. And so we need to make sure that we are keeping abreast of it. The other thing we need to keep abreast of is investment in this research, in quantum research. So the Chinese right now are sort of moving ahead of us faster and faster, and we're sort of kind of still in sort of third gear wondering, where we need to go. So we need to be continually investing in these types of things. We really don't have a national science policy. If you think about it, so we really don't have a focus on some of these new technologies coming forward. We're not putting the dollars into it. Again, it goes back to we're spending money on increasing the deficits, but we're not spending money on critical infrastructure or critical research needs.
Great question. Yes.
Hey, so with Amazon coming in and all the jobs in Northern Virginia, what can we expect as far as like a workforce vacuum? We already saw that there's more job openings than we have workers. What can we expect to see around that as that's coming in?
So we kind of expect to see that as Amazon opens up and sort of draws individuals into those areas, that at the current rate of our production of computer science graduates, we probably will see more and more openings here in the state of Maryland, which will mean that either we have to do more with less or figure out how to get more students into it. And again, this might be opportunities for individuals to be more in badging and certification programs rather than sort of four-year undergraduate programs. Or individuals who perhaps want to change of career, already have a bachelor's degree, but decide they want to go into the exciting field of IT, and so they earn a certification and sort of get industry, certified. The question is really that's a challenge. I mean, right now, one of the biggest challenges, especially for Maryland firms who are dealing with the government, is security clearance. So if you're a foreign national, so we graduate a lot of individuals who are foreign nationals in computer science. They can't work for any of the major firms here in the state of Maryland, especially those that have government contracts because of security clearance. Obviously, they can't work for any of the major installations, but they could work for Amazon. So there might be some opportunities of flipping around. Now, security clearance not only applies to foreign nationals, but individuals might also have one of the biggest reasons why many people fail is security clearance is financial. So if you have a poor financial record, you may not be able to get your security clearance. However, you may be able to work for Amazon. So there might be some opportunities for individuals to take some opportunities and correct from past mistakes.
Great. Yeah.
You spoke briefly about the local election, and my clients are most concerned about the national election. From a capital markets assumption forecasting models, how are you dictating whether or not Mr. Trump stays in power versus a Democrat coming into office, and views on how that will affect the stock market almost immediately?
So that's a tough question. So I would say, arguably, so depending upon which, So I would say there's going to be a dip down if a Democrat were to be elected. And this sort of the trend has been sort of when a Democrat gets elected, people are worried that they're going to be taxed and spent to death. But given these last 4 years, I'm not sure what would happen. I mean, if this is sort of a traditional sort of a presidency, we might expect to see that, if a Democrat got elected, we would expect to see some dip down in the stock market. The other challenge I suspect is depending upon how the Senate or the House goes. Because it's one thing to have a Democratic elected president, but if you have a majority Senate, you're still running the same uncertainty as you had before when Obama was a president of not being able to get legislation passed. So I would argue that this is sort of a very up in the air. And the good news is because basically, as economists don't pay much credence to the stock market in terms of sort of, as a driver of the economy, who knows? So.
I will also just tack on, related to our forecast, a lot of the forecasting that we do is pretty sticky because when a new administration comes in, it doesn't really happen overnight that there's brand new, large-scale macroeconomic changes. It does take some time to filter through the economy. So even if there is an administration change in 2020, we may not see large-scale changes to the economy until much later.
You talked about job growth and spending, and also then a slide came up about retirement and job opportunities, and there was this big jump from those that jobs that open up because of retirement. I started thinking about that number and how impactful it would be. What is your thought on the aging population, that impact of those that are going into retirement, their cost of care for the younger families, and then the direction of spending for those younger families that are going to be taking care of that older generation? Can you talk about that?
So currently the average retiree or people near retirement, average 401k is about 100k. So they're under financed in terms of their the retirement plans. They're relying on sort of Social Security or perhaps some pension plan. But generally speaking, this is going to be a different sort of scenario than in years past. We'll probably see much more cohabitation. So households will begin to sort of combine. Perhaps the young kids will move up from the basement and into the main level as they grow up and help take care of mom and dad. The challenge will be, obviously, is the cost of that care will be rather enormous because oftentimes you need specialized individuals. So hence the reason why we need more healthcare individuals. This does kind of, play a little concern, right? So in one sense, basically, if you're able to move back in with mom and dad to take care of them, you don't have to worry about buying a house, perhaps, say. But then you also incur the expenses of sort of providing for nursing care. So it is going to be a big sea change, I think, in terms of sort of the ongoing. But as people say, the 60 is now the new 50, and so we're expecting people to work longer and longer into their careers. So, as I said, the 2044 is the next golden anniversary. I plan to be here. I'll be 80 years old. Do the math. But generally speaking, it is a concern, and not to trivialize it. So we're talking everything from people aging in place, transportation issues, getting around. Well, the good news is with autonomous vehicles, people will be able to hop into the car, take them to the doctor's appointment. So it'll be almost transportation on demand, which would certainly be good and safe for the rest of us. But generally speaking, there is going to be a socioeconomic change that perhaps we've not experienced before. You might akin to the point of when we talked about sort of the households moving away from some of the rural areas into the cities and how that transformed some of the fabric of the family. I think it's going to be similar when we have the reverse situation.
Do you see universal basic income being a viable option to help to mitigate job loss with the rise in automation?
I haven't given it much thought. I know there's some countries have explored it. It is, to provide a base level of income to sort of ensure that you're able to sort of, survive is an interesting approach. I'm just not sure if America is ready for that level of socialism or handout. So I'm not 100% sure that's going to fly necessarily. I think it'll slowly take on. It does have some big economic impacts going forward, but it does also provide the fact that individuals who receive money tend to spend money, which then helps the economy. So we talk about unemployment insurance, when people threaten to shrink it or to cut it back or to cut off after a while, it really doesn't, it hurts the economy more so than it helps the economy.
Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
What's your reaction to the current situation with Under Armour and Kevin Plank stepping down and that investigation into their accounting practices and how it might impact Baltimore?
So Under Armour is iconic Maryland institution, big contributor to College Park. So it is concerning, right? So when you don't want a publicly traded company to be all of a sudden under investigation by both the SEC and FBI for accounting practices. So, wait for the other shoe to drop. Kevin Plank stepping down, he was obviously the leader. Now you have another individual. I mean, Under Armour was struggling prior to him stepping down. I mean, Adidas, Nike, and other companies were sort of eating into their market share. They were no longer the only game in town in terms of sports performance shirts. So it is concerning. So I would say that is something a long-term look and see what's going to happen. But obviously the findings from the SEC and the FBI are going to be critical to how they're going to survive. They may have to be restructured or the valuation may be taken down based upon sort of the findings.
Oh, got one here in the back.
Okay. Hi, you've touched on infrastructure, roads, proximity to jobs, autonomous vehicles. Can you comment on the role of public transportation to support jobs in the area?
So I'm not going to steal Mike's thunder because part of it is also the issue is that public transportation is critical. Right now, from Towson to get to the Amazon warehouse, it's about an hour-plus bus ride with numerous transfers. It does require an Uber to get from here to a closer bus stop. So it is a challenge. We did a study. You guys did a study a couple of months ago that shows that the median time is tremendous. So we're expecting people to work in Amazon from the west side of Baltimore to take a 90-minute bus ride. So it's critical to fix it. So you can go fixed rail, which we tried with the red line, didn't get passed. I would argue that if we start thinking about autonomous vehicles as being service on demand, that might sort of alleviate some of the public transportation, but that won't be out for another at least 20 years at the earliest. It is critical. It is critical to have good, reliable public transportation. I think one of the bigger challenges, and I think there's people from MTA around here who live and breathe public transportation, but it is a critical infrastructure need for our region. And I would argue that oftentimes we forget about the rural poverty. So a lot of times we focus on sort of the urban challenges, but don't forget, in Easton and other places where individuals are living in sort of isolated areas, there is no public transportation. So we at least here in the city have public transportation, albeit it's not the best. In rural parts of the state, if you don't have a car, you can't get to work. You can't get your doctor's appointment, you can't do anything. So we also need to really think about some of those areas as well. How are they being addressed by public transportation? How are they issues? So yeah, public transportation is critical.
Yeah, and we'll have, there is a policy brief in the folder that everyone has in front of them that does touch on public transportation, alternative modes of commuting, and we'll have a few slides on that coming up as well. And yes?
So healthcare has been a big part of this presentation, also government spending. So I was wondering to see what the opinion is about what would be the effect on the economy of the implementation of, say, Senator Warren's plan for increase of government spending, Medicare for all, would be upon the greater economy as a whole, how that would impact healthcare, service, and incomes and government spending as well.
So we're talking about sort of universal health care, and that some of it's funded by the fact that employers no longer pay their portion, but they pay it to the government. So this is an issue that is controversial, and I haven't given it much thought necessarily. I believe that healthcare is a right, not a privilege of employment. And the way our healthcare structure was built was based on sort of the way to get around wage freezes during World War II, where Kaiser Steel figured that if they provided some sort of health insurance for their employees, they could then basically lure more employees to work for them. For some reason, we've stuck with the employer-based health insurance, and as a result, if you're not working, you don't get health insurance, and so therefore you're kind of suffering at the hands of the market. So I would argue that there needs to be a way to ensure that all get health insurance. Now I would argue, well, uninsured people go to the hospital. Yes, well, we end up paying for that in terms of higher premiums for ourselves. So there is no, well, we won't have private insurance. Well, that's great, except we still pay for the uninsured individuals via our premium. So we need to think about this sort of holistically, not sort of as a political football. We want to ensure that all our citizens are healthy. We want to make sure that basically individuals don't walk around with communicable diseases, that they be able to go to the doctor. Because if they're walking around with communicable diseases, who knows, I might get sick. And I'm really the most important person to me right now. This is me, about me. So I don't want to get sick by someone who couldn't go to the doctor because they couldn't afford to go to the doctor, or they had to go to the emergency room to treat a chronic symptom that could have been dealt with at half the cost or a tenth of the cost by having regular checkups. So I believe that there needs to be a solution to the healthcare provision. How it comes about, whether it's sort of a mix of private as well as some public, I think is sort of really up to policymakers. But we can't continue to have sort of these polar positions of, it's going to be the private market. Situations like, why are health insurance limited to state lines? Should we not have a national health insurance? So something like Costco or Amazon be able to provide us health care. Who knows?
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And yeah, wonderful. If you have other questions, please feel free to hunt Darius down after this event. I'm sure he would love to be cornered and answer any and all pressing concerns you may have.